My 8-year-old granddaughter rolled her eyes and said, "You can't sit with us. Mom said you're an old burden." The table burst out laughing, including my son. I stood up and left quietly. That night he texted, "Payment still due tomorrow?" I answered, "Figure it out." Next day, panic. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. Let me tell you how a grandmother's broken heart became a family's worst nightmare. It started at Jessica's birthday party, though honestly, I should have seen it coming months ago. You know how they say hindsight is 20/20? Well, mine turned out to be laser-focused. I'm Margaret Sullivan, but everyone calls me Maggie. 67 years old, retired elementary school teacher, and apparently the family ATM according to my own son. 3 years ago, when my husband Frank died, I thought my biggest worry would be loneliness. Turns out, it was my own family treating me like their personal bank with a beating heart attached. The party was at some fancy restaurant downtown. Jessica had insisted on celebrating her 42nd birthday there, despite the fact that my monthly contribution to their mortgage was what made such luxuries possible. But did anyone mention that? Of course not. I arrived precisely at 6, wearing my best navy dress and the pearl necklace Frank gave me on our 25th anniversary. Call me old-fashioned, but I still believe in making an effort for family occasions. The hostess led me through the crowded restaurant to a large round table where David, my son, sat with his wife Jessica and their 2 kids. "Mom!" David stood up, giving me one of those quick, obligatory hugs. "You made it." "Of course I made it. It's Jessica's birthday." I smiled at my daughter-in-law, who managed a tight smile in return. Jessica had never quite warmed to me, even after 15 years of marriage to my son. According to her, I was too involved, too opinionated, too much of everything. My granddaughter Chloe was picking at her chicken nuggets while my grandson Tyler played on his phone, completely oblivious to the adults around him. Normal family dinner behavior, nothing unusual there. The trouble started when Jessica's sister Karen arrived with her husband and twin daughters. The girls, both around Chloe's age, immediately commandeered the conversation with stories about their recent vacation to Disney World. Private school tuition, designer clothes, the works. Everything Jessica desperately wanted but couldn't quite afford on David's construction manager's salary. "Girls, why don't you sit together at that end of the table?" Jessica suggested, gesturing toward the seats near me. That's when my granddaughter Chloe looked directly at me and delivered the line that would change everything. "You can't sit with us. Mom said you're an old burden." The words hit me like a physical blow. Around the table, Karen's family chuckled uncomfortably. David actually laughed, shaking his head like it was the cutest thing he'd ever heard. Jessica smirked behind her wine glass. For a moment, I just sat there, processing what had just happened. My own granddaughter, coached by her mother, had called me a burden. At a public dinner, in front of extended family, and my son found it amusing. I stood up slowly, placing my napkin on the table with deliberate care. "Well," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my chest, "I suppose I won't burden anyone with my presence any longer." "Mom, she's just being silly," David said. But he was still grinning, still finding it funny that his 8-year-old daughter had been taught to insult her grandmother. "Is she?" I asked. "Or is she simply repeating what she's heard at home?" The table went quiet. Jessica's smirk faded slightly, but the damage was done. I gathered my purse and walked out of that restaurant with as much dignity as I could muster, leaving behind a family that clearly saw me as nothing more than a generous old fool. The drive home gave me plenty of time to think. 3 years of widowhood, 2 years of paying David and Jessica's mortgage because they claimed his construction business was struggling, countless emergency expenses I'd covered without question, the vacation fund I'd established for the grandchildren, the private school tuition I'd been discreetly paying because public schools weren't good enough for Jessica's standards. All of it, apparently, had earned me the title of Old Burden. That night, around 11, my phone buzzed with a text from David. The message was brief and telling. "Payment still due tomorrow? Jessica wants to confirm the transfer went through before the bank closes." I stared at that text for a long time. 2 sentences that perfectly summarized our relationship. No apology for his daughter's behavior. No acknowledgement of how cruel the evening had been. Just a reminder that I owed them money. My response was even briefer. Figure it out. I turned off my phone and went to bed, sleeping better than I had in months. Sometimes the most powerful word in the English language is simply no. But that was just the beginning of their education in consequences. The next morning brought 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. I made my coffee, fed my cat Whiskers, and read every single panicked message while enjoying my toast with homemade strawberry jam. Amazing how quickly an emergency develops when the money tap gets turned off. "Mom, please call back," read one message from David. "There's been a misunderstanding," read another from Jessica. "Grandma, I'm sorry," from Chloe, obviously typed by Jessica. The mortgage payment was due by 3 o'clock that afternoon. Without my $2,000 monthly contribution, they were $800 short. I knew this because I'd been quietly reviewing their finances for months, wondering why they needed so much help despite David's decent salary. The coffee was particularly good that morning. Sumatran dark roast, the expensive kind I usually saved for special occasions. But watching my family panic over their own financial irresponsibility felt special enough to warrant the good coffee. At 9:15, my doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see David's pickup truck in my driveway. He stood on my front porch looking exactly like he had when he was 16 and trying to explain why he'd dented my car. "Morning, sweetheart," I said, opening the door with a bright smile. "You're up early." "Mom, what's going on? You didn't send the mortgage payment." "No," I agreed, "I didn't." He pushed past me into my living room, clearly expecting our usual routine where I immediately apologized for whatever had upset him. Instead, I closed the door and waited. "The payment is due today." "Payment? You know that. You've been making it for 2 years." "I have indeed. 24 payments to be exact. $48,000. I'd done the math the night before, and seeing his face when I said the number out loud was deeply satisfying. "We've been over this. The business has been slow." "Has it really?" I settled into my armchair. The one Frank used to claim was more comfortable than any throne. Because Jessica seemed quite confident last night when she called me a burden. People who burden others rarely deserve continued generosity. David's face flushed. "She didn't mean it that way." "Oh, I think she meant it exactly that way. And I think you agreed with her, considering how entertaining you found Chloe's little performance. Look, Mom, we can discuss this later. Right now, I need you to call the bank and make the transfer." The sheer audacity left me speechless for a moment. No apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just a demand that I continue funding their lifestyle despite being humiliated the night before. "David," I said slowly, "I'm going to say this once, so listen carefully. I will never make another mortgage payment for you. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." His mouth opened and closed like a fish. "You can't be serious." "Completely serious. In fact, I'm curious how you plan to make the payment today. The bank called yesterday to confirm the usual transfer time. I told them there would be no transfer today or any day moving forward." "Mom, you're being ridiculous. One stupid comment from an 8-year-old and you're willing to destroy our family?" "I'm not destroying anything. I'm simply closing the Bank of Maggie. Permanently." The color drained from his face as the reality hit him. Without my monthly payment, they couldn't afford their mortgage. Without their house, they couldn't maintain the lifestyle Jessica demanded. The carefully constructed house of cards was about to collapse. "We'll lose the house," he said quietly. "Then perhaps you should have thought about that before allowing your daughter to insult me in public." I stood up, signaling that our conversation was over. "I have garden club at 11. You'll need to figure this out on your own." "Mom, please, we can work something out. Jessica can apologize. Jessica has had 2 years to show me respect. Instead, she chose to teach my granddaughter that I'm a burden. That ship has sailed, David." He tried pleading, bargaining, even threatening. Nothing worked because I'd finally realized something important. I didn't owe them a comfortable life just because we shared DNA. After he left, I called my financial advisor, Martha, and made an appointment for the next day. If I was closing the Bank of Maggie, I might as well figure out what to do with all the money I'd been throwing away. The afternoon brought Jessica to my door, tears streaming down her face, promising changes that would never come. I listened politely, served her tea, and sent her away empty-handed. That evening, Tyler called, my 12-year-old grandson, trying to manipulate Grandma into saving the day. "Grandma Maggie, Mom said we might have to move if you don't help with the house payment. Your mother is correct, I told him gently. But Tyler, that's not your problem to worry about. That's your parents' job to figure out. But you can fix it, right? You always fix everything. The innocence in his voice nearly broke my resolve. Nearly. Sometimes, sweetie, people have to fix their own problems. Your parents are adults. They'll figure it out. But as I hung up the phone, I wondered if they actually would. The foreclosure notice appeared on their door exactly 31 days later. I know because Tyler texted me a photo of it, along with a message that said, "Grandma, are you really going to let us become homeless?" I was sitting in my garden when the text arrived, enjoying the morning sun and the sight of my prize-winning roses in full bloom. Frank had always said I had magic hands when it came to growing things. Apparently, those same hands were quite effective at stopping the flow of unearned money. The notice gave them 90 days to bring their mortgage current or face eviction, 3 months to figure out what they should have been handling all along. But instead of using that time wisely, they launched what I came to think of as the campaign to break Grandma. It started with the guilt trips. Jessica left voicemails sobbing about how the children would suffer. David showed up unannounced with fake emergencies, hoping to catch me in a moment of weakness. Even my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, got recruited to their cause, stopping by to mention how sad it was when families fell apart over money. Money, I told Mrs. Henderson, while we shared iced tea on my front porch, has nothing to do with it. This is about respect, something that seems to be in short supply these days. The second week brought escalation. Chloe's teacher called to express concern about the child's emotional state. Apparently, Chloe had been telling everyone at school that her mean grandmother was making her family homeless. The teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, was tactful but clear in her message. Couldn't I find it in my heart to help my own family? Ms. Rodriguez, I explained patiently, Chloe's parents earn a combined income of over $80,000 a year. They chose a house they couldn't afford and asked me to subsidize their poor decision. I'm not making anyone homeless. I'm simply refusing to enable financial irresponsibility. The third week brought my sister Patricia into the mix. Patricia lived in Seattle and only called twice a year, usually when she needed something. This time, she needed me to stop embarrassing the family by letting David and Jessica lose their house. "Maggie, what's gotten into you? Frank would be horrified by this behavior." "Frank," I replied crisply, "would be horrified by a grandson who lets his 8-year-old daughter insult her grandmother and finds it amusing. Frank believed in respect, Patricia. You might try remembering that." But the real surprise came during week 4, when my attorney called. "Mrs. Sullivan, this is Robert Martinez from Martinez and Associates. I represent your son, David Sullivan, in a legal matter concerning you." I nearly dropped the phone. "I beg your pardon? Your son is filing for conservatorship, claiming you're no longer capable of making sound financial decisions. He's provided evidence of erratic behavior and poor judgment that suggests diminished mental capacity." The audacity was breathtaking. David was actually trying to have me declared incompetent so he could control my money and force me to resume mortgage payments. My own son was attempting to steal my financial independence because I dared to say no. "Mr. Martinez," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. My mental capacity is perfectly intact. In fact, it's clearer now than it's been in years. Ma'am, I'm simply calling to inform you of the proceedings. You'll need legal representation." After hanging up, I sat in Frank's old chair and laughed until tears ran down my face. David had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He'd escalated this from a simple financial boundary to a full-scale war, and he had no idea who he was fighting. The next morning, I called Harrison, Blackwood and Associates, the most respected family law firm in the city. Not only did they handle conservatorship disputes, but they specialized in protecting elderly clients from financial abuse by family members. "Mrs. Sullivan," said attorney Sarah Blackwood during our initial consultation, "what you're describing is unfortunately common. Adult children who feel entitled to their parents' money often resort to legal intimidation when the money stops flowing. Can he actually have me declared incompetent? He can try. But he'll need medical evidence, multiple professional evaluations, and proof of genuine mental decline. From our conversation today, you're clearly competent. In fact, Stopping payments to an ungrateful family shows excellent judgment. What can we do? Sarah smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. We defend you vigorously, and then we go on the offensive. Financial elder abuse is a crime, Mrs. Sullivan. If he's been manipulating you for money while allowing his family to mistreat you, we can pursue charges. I don't want to see him in prison. Maybe not. But the threat of prosecution tends to resolve these situations quickly. As I drove home from the lawyer's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation. David wanted to play hardball? Perfect. He'd just challenged a 67-year-old woman who'd spent 40 years managing classroom full of unruly children, balanced family finances through 3 economic recessions, and nursed a stubborn husband through cancer without losing her mind once. He was about to learn that grandmothers don't become doormats when they age. Sometimes they just get more strategic about when and how they fight back. That evening, David called. "Mom, I didn't want it to come to this, but you're forcing my hand." "Am I?" I asked sweetly. "How interesting. Tell me, David, exactly how much money do you think I have?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said. How much money do you think I have? Since you're so concerned about my financial decisions, surely you've done your homework." Silence on the other end. Of course he had no idea. He'd never bothered to understand my finances beyond assuming there was an endless supply of money for his convenience. "We'll talk about this in court," he finally said. "Yes," I agreed. "We certainly will." The court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late September. I arrived early, wearing my best charcoal gray suit and carrying a briefcase that belonged to Frank. Inside that briefcase was 3 years' worth of financial records, medical reports from my recent physical examination, and a psychological evaluation that confirmed what I already knew. I was sharper now than I'd been in years. David arrived with Jessica and a lawyer who looked barely old enough to shave. They sat across the courtroom aisle, whispering urgently among themselves. Jessica kept glancing at me with a mixture of anger and disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend how their foolproof plan had gone so wrong. The judge, Honorable Patricia Wells, was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She reviewed the petitions with the careful attention of someone who'd seen too many families destroy themselves over money. David's lawyer went first, painting a picture of an elderly woman whose judgment had become impaired following her husband's death. He presented evidence of my erratic financial behavior, the sudden cessation of mortgage payments, the closing of accounts that had previously been accessible to family members, and what he called irrational hostility toward my son and his family. "Your Honor," the young lawyer said earnestly, "Mrs. Sullivan's behavior represents a dramatic departure from years of generous, loving support. This sudden change suggests cognitive decline that requires professional intervention." I wanted to laugh. According to David's version of events, sanity was defined as unlimited financial generosity, while setting boundaries was evidence of mental illness. Then it was Sarah's turn. "Your Honor, Mrs. Sullivan is here today because she committed the apparently unforgivable sin of saying no to adult children who felt entitled to her money." Sarah stood with quiet confidence, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "This isn't a case of diminished capacity. It's a case of enhanced clarity." She presented my medical records first. Blood pressure excellent. Cognitive function tests perfect. My doctor's written opinion that I was in remarkable health for a 67-year-old woman. Then came my financial records, meticulously organized and clearly showing that I'd given David and Jessica over $60,000 in the past 2 years alone. Mrs. Sullivan didn't stop thinking clearly, Your Honor. She started thinking clearly. She realized she was being taken advantage of by family members who showed her no respect, no gratitude, and ultimately taught their 8-year-old daughter to publicly humiliate her grandmother. The real bombshell came when Sarah presented the recordings. "Your Honor, Mrs. Sullivan began documenting conversations with her son after he threatened to have her declared incompetent. These recordings, made legally in her own home with single-party consent, reveal the true nature of this family relationship. The first recording played David's voice, demanding money and threatening legal action when I refused. The second captured Jessica complaining to a friend on speakerphone about how they'd have to find another way to squeeze money out of the old bat once the conservatorship was established. The courtroom fell silent as my daughter-in-law's voice filled the air, discussing me like I was a resource to be exploited rather than a human being deserving of basic respect. Judge Wells's expression darkened considerably. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, addressing David directly, "do you have anything to say about these recordings?" David looked like a man who'd just realized he was standing in quicksand. "Your Honor, those conversations were taken out of context. What context makes it appropriate to refer to your mother as the old bat while discussing strategies to access her money?" No answer, because there wasn't one. Judge Wells reviewed her notes for what felt like an eternity before speaking. "This petition for conservatorship is denied. Furthermore, I'm referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential elder financial abuse." The gavel fell, and with it, David's master plan crumbled into dust. Outside the courthouse, Sarah and I stood on the steps watching David, Jessica, and their lawyer huddle in heated discussion next to their car. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now they realize they've made a catastrophic error in judgment. The DA will investigate, and they'll face possible criminal charges for financial abuse. More importantly for them, they've lost any chance of accessing your money ever again." I watched my son gesture frantically at his wife, clearly engaged in the kind of argument that destroys marriages. Jessica's face was red with fury, and she kept pointing in my direction, as if this was all somehow my fault. "Do you think they'll actually file charges?" I asked. "That depends on what the investigation turns up. But Mrs. Sullivan, even if they don't prosecute, your son and daughter-in-law now understand that you're not the helpless old woman they thought you were. They underestimated you badly." As we walked toward our cars, my phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. "Grandma, Mom, and Dad are really upset. Can we come over and talk?" I showed the message to Sarah, who shook her head. "They're going to try to rebuild the relationship now that legal intimidation failed. Be very careful about letting them back into your life without genuine changes." That evening, as I sat in my garden with a glass of wine, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just 2 months. I'd gone from being a family ATM to being a woman who'd stood up in court and defended her right to dignity and respect. The roses smelled particularly sweet that night, and the setting sun painted my garden in shades of gold and crimson. For the first time since Frank's death, I felt truly alive. But something told me David and Jessica weren't finished yet. Desperate people do desperate things, and losing in court had only made them more desperate. I was right to be cautious. 3 weeks after the court hearing, I discovered exactly how desperate they'd become when my neighbor called at 6 in the morning. "Maggie, there's a U-Haul truck in David's driveway. They're loading furniture." I stood at my bedroom window, watching the circus unfold across the street. David, Jessica, and what appeared to be several friends were moving boxes and furniture with the frantic energy of people running from something. Or towards something. My phone rang immediately, David's number. "Mom, I wanted you to hear this from me first. We're moving." "I can see that. Where are you going?" "Phoenix. Jessica's sister has a house there, and I can get construction work. Better opportunities." His voice carried that fake cheerfulness he'd used since childhood when trying to cover up trouble. "How wonderful for you all. The children must be excited about a new adventure." "About that, Mom. The kids are going to stay with you." I nearly dropped the phone. "Excuse me?" "Just temporarily, until we get settled and find a place with good schools. Jessica thinks it would be easier if they stayed in familiar surroundings for now." The sheer audacity left me speechless. They were abandoning their children and expecting me to provide free childcare while they escaped the financial mess they'd created. "David," I said slowly, "let me make sure I understand this correctly. You're moving to Phoenix, leaving Tyler and Chloe behind and assuming I'll take care of them. It's not abandoning them, Mom. It's just practical. They can finish the school year here. And who, precisely, asked me if I was willing to become a guardian to 2 children?" Silence. Because, of course, nobody had asked me. They'd simply assumed that good old Grandma Maggie would step up and solve another problem they'd created. "The thing is," David continued, his voice growing more desperate, "we already told the kids. They're excited to spend time with Grandma." Through my window, I watched Tyler and Chloe sitting on their front steps, looking anything but excited. They looked confused, scared, and abandoned. My heart broke for them, even as fury rose in my chest. David, you will not dump your children on me because you've made poor financial decisions. Mom, please, we don't have any other options. You have plenty of options. You can take responsibility for your children like adults do. You can take them with you to Phoenix. You can find local employment instead of running away. What you cannot do is make your problems my responsibility. But the kids need stability. They need parents who don't abandon them when life gets difficult. The call ended with David promising to figure something out, but I could see through my window that nothing was changing. The U-Haul continued loading, and 2 children continued sitting on steps waiting to learn their fate. An hour later, Jessica knocked on my door. She'd clearly been crying, and her usual polished appearance was nowhere in evidence. Maggie, please don't make this harder than it already is. I'm not making anything hard. You and David created this situation entirely on your own. We have to leave today. David owes money to some contractors who are threatening to sue. We can't take the kids right now because we'll be sleeping on my sister's couch until David finds work. The truth, finally. They weren't just moving for better opportunities. They were fleeing creditors, probably using money problems as an excuse to abandon parenting responsibilities they'd never wanted. Jessica, I'm going to say this once and very clearly. I will not take custody of Tyler and Chloe. I will not become their guardian. I will not solve this problem for you. Then what are we supposed to do? Take them with you. Accept your sister's help for all 4 of you instead of just 2. Be parents. You're really going to let your own grandchildren become homeless? The manipulation was impressive. I had to admit, turn abandonment into homelessness, make it my fault instead of theirs, appeal to emotions rather than logic. I'm not making anyone homeless. You are making the choice to leave your children behind, and I am making the choice not to enable that decision. Jessica left crying, but the packing continued. At noon, I called Child Protective Services. I'd like to report a situation involving 2 minors who are about to be abandoned by their parents, I told the caseworker who answered. The process was swift and professional. 2 social workers arrived within an hour, just as David and Jessica were loading the last boxes into their truck. I watched from my living room window as official paperwork was served and serious conversations were held on the sidewalk. The final outcome took 3 hours to resolve. David and Jessica could leave for Phoenix if they chose, but Tyler and Chloe would be placed with emergency foster care unless suitable family arrangements could be made immediately. The caseworker knocked on my door at 4 o'clock. Mrs. Sullivan, I'm Maria Santos from Child Protective Services. Your son and daughter-in-law indicated you might be willing to provide temporary care for the children while they relocate. I'm afraid they were mistaken. I've made it clear that I cannot take on that responsibility. Maria nodded understandingly. We have a very good emergency placement family who can take both children tonight. They'll remain in the same school district and will work on permanent arrangements once your son establishes residency in Arizona. Through the window, I could see David and Jessica arguing furiously beside their loaded truck while Tyler and Chloe sat on the curb, clutching small suitcases someone had packed for them. My resolve almost broke when Chloe looked toward my house with tears streaming down her 8-year-old face. Almost. But I'd learned something important over these past few months. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when the consequences hurt everyone involved. David and Jessica left for Phoenix that evening, driving away from their children without a backward glance. Tyler and Chloe went to stay with the Morrison family, experienced foster parents who specialized in emergency placements. That night, I sat in my garden with a heavy heart, wondering if I'd made the right choice. Had I saved those children from parents who would have abandoned them eventually anyway? Or had I failed in my duty as their grandmother? Time would tell. But one thing I knew for certain: David and Jessica had shown their true character when faced with real adversity. And sometimes the most important lesson children can learn is that actions have consequences, even for the people they love most. The roses bloomed beautifully that night, their perfume carrying on the evening breeze like a promise that even the most difficult decisions can lead to unexpected beauty. But I had a feeling this story was far from over. 2 months later, I learned that David and Jessica had never made it to Phoenix. They'd been arrested in Las Vegas with a car full of stolen construction equipment. Apparently, my son's debt to contractors was actually stolen goods he'd been fencing. The cherry on top? They'd used my mortgage money to fund their criminal enterprise. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. The news came from Maria Santos during one of her regular check-ins about Tyler and Chloe. She sat in my living room, reviewing paperwork while I served coffee and homemade cookies. "Mrs. Sullivan, I have some updates about your son and daughter-in-law's situation." Her tone was carefully professional, but I caught the hint of satisfaction underneath. "Please, tell me they're not trying to drag those children into whatever mess they've created now." Actually, quite the opposite. They've been charged with theft, receiving stolen goods, and interstate transport of stolen property. They're looking at serious prison time. I set down my coffee cup with a steady hand, though inside I was reeling. How serious? 3 to 5 years minimum, possibly longer if they can't make restitution to the victims. Maria pulled out a legal document. "They've also formally relinquished their parental rights." The words hit me like a physical blow. They what? Yesterday afternoon, they signed papers surrendering all legal rights to Tyler and Chloe. The children are now wards of the state, pending permanent placement. I stared out my kitchen window, watching Mrs. Henderson water her garden next door. Everything looked so normal, so peaceful, while my family had completely imploded just miles away. Does this mean the children will stay with the Morrison family permanently? Not necessarily. The state prefers placement with family members when possible. Since you're their grandmother, you would have first consideration if you're interested in applying for custody. The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 months ago, David and Jessica had tried to dump their children on me while they fled their responsibilities. Now they were in prison, and the state was asking if I wanted the children they'd abandoned. What about their attempts to have me declared incompetent? Wouldn't that affect my eligibility? Maria smiled. Actually, the court's findings work in your favor. Judge Wells specifically noted your mental acuity and sound judgment in her ruling. Combined with the criminal charges against your son, it paints a clear picture of who the responsible adult is in this situation. After Maria left, I sat in Frank's old chair and tried to process everything. David wasn't just financially irresponsible or emotionally manipulative. He was an actual criminal who'd been stealing from his employers and using my money to support his illegal activities. Every mortgage payment I'd made hadn't helped struggling young parents. It had funded a criminal enterprise. My generosity had literally been financing theft. The really infuriating part? I could have figured this out months ago if I'd paid attention to the right details. David's slow construction business, but designer clothes. Jessica's complaints about money while posting vacation photos on social media. The vague explanations about work projects that never seemed to get completed. I'd been so focused on being a good mother and grandmother that I'd ignored obvious red flags. Again. But that was the old Maggie. The new Maggie was going to make different choices. The next morning, I called Sarah Blackwood and scheduled an appointment to discuss custody proceedings. Then I called the Morrison family and asked if I could visit Tyler and Chloe that weekend. The Morrison house was a comfortable 2-story colonial with toys scattered across the front yard and children's artwork covering the refrigerator. Linda Morrison, a warm woman in her 40s, greeted me with genuine kindness. "Mrs. Sullivan, the children will be so excited to see you. They talk about you constantly." Tyler and Chloe were playing board games in the living room when I arrived. Both children looked healthier than they had in months. Tyler had gained weight, and Chloe's perpetual anxiety seemed to have faded. "Grandma Maggie!" Chloe launched herself into my arms with enthusiasm I hadn't seen since she was very young, before Jessica had taught her that I was a burden. "Hey kiddo, how are you settling in here?" "It's really good. Linda makes pancakes every Saturday, and Tom helps me with my math homework. And guess what? I'm not scared all the time anymore." The casual mention of fear caught my attention. "Scared of what, sweetheart?" "Mom and Dad fighting. About money and mean people calling the house. Sometimes Dad would get really angry and throw things. But it's quiet here. Peaceful quiet. Not scary quiet." Tyler nodded from across the room. "Mom used to cry a lot when she thought we couldn't hear. And Dad was always on the phone with people who made him mad. These children had been living with far more stress and dysfunction than I'd realized. David and Jessica's money problems weren't just about poor budgeting. They'd been creating a genuinely unstable environment for their kids. I spent 3 hours at the Morrison house, and by the time I left, 2 things were crystal clear. First, Tyler and Chloe were thriving in a stable environment for the first time in years. Second, they deserved grandparents who put their welfare above personal convenience. That evening, I called Sarah Blackwood. "I want to file for custody," I told her without preamble. "Are you sure? Taking on 2 children at your age is a significant commitment." "Sarah, those children have been failed by every adult in their lives except the Morrisons. I failed them too when I refused to take them in. I won't make that mistake again. This is different from temporary emergency care, Mrs. Sullivan. This would be permanent legal guardianship, possibly adoption. Are you prepared for school events, teenage drama, college applications, and everything that comes with full-time parenting?" I looked around my quiet house, seeing it through new eyes. The spare bedrooms that had been gathering dust, the big kitchen table that seated 8 but only fed 1, the garden that could easily accommodate a swing set and sandbox. I'm 67 years old, Sarah. I'm healthy, financially stable, and I just spent 3 months learning exactly how much backbone I have when people try to take advantage of me. I think I can handle 2 children who actually deserve my help. Then let's get started on the paperwork. The custody process would take months, but I wasn't worried about the outcome. I had excellent legal representation, a clean record, and most importantly, I was fighting for something worthwhile instead of against people who'd betrayed me. For the first time since this whole mess started, I was moving towards something positive instead of just away from something negative. But first, I had a house to transform and a life to redesign, because being a full-time grandmother at 67 was going to require some serious planning. The old Maggie might have been intimidated by such a massive life change. The new Maggie was already shopping for bunk beds online. The custody hearing was scheduled for December 15th, exactly 6 months after David and Jessica had driven away from their children. I arrived at the courthouse wearing my best navy suit and carrying a folder thick with character references, financial statements, and a detailed parenting plan I'd developed with help from a family counselor. Tyler and Chloe sat with Maria Santos in the front row, both dressed in their best clothes and looking nervous but hopeful. Over the past 2 months, they'd been visiting my house every weekend, slowly settling into routines that felt natural and right. Judge Wells presided over this hearing too, and I took her presence as a positive sign. She already knew the family history and had seen firsthand how David and Jessica operated. "Mrs. Sullivan," Judge Wells began, "you're petitioning for permanent custody of your grandchildren following their parents' incarceration and voluntary termination of parental rights. This is a significant responsibility. Are you prepared for the challenges of raising 2 children at your age?" "Your Honor, I raised 1 child already, though I apparently did a poor job given how he turned out." A small chuckle rippled through the courtroom. "I believe I've learned from those mistakes and can do better with a second chance." The hearing proceeded smoothly. Sarah presented evidence of my financial stability, physical and mental health, and the home modifications I'd already completed. The social workers' reports were glowing, and Tyler and Chloe's own testimonies were heartfelt. "I want to live with Grandma Maggie," Chloe told the judge in a clear, confident voice. "She makes me feel safe, and she doesn't yell about money all the time." Tyler was equally direct. "Grandma's house feels like home now. She helps with homework and doesn't get mad when I ask questions." But the real surprise came when Linda Morrison requested to speak on my behalf. "Your Honor, my husband and I have been foster parents for 8 years. We've cared for dozens of children, and we understand what healthy family dynamics look like." Linda's voice was steady and professional. "Tyler and Chloe have transformed during their time with us, but they've flourished even more during their weekend visits with Mrs. Sullivan. She provides exactly the combination of structure, affection, and stability these children need." Judge Wells reviewed her notes carefully before rendering her decision. "Based on the evidence presented and the clear best interests of the children, I grant permanent custody of Tyler and Chloe Sullivan to their grandmother, Margaret Sullivan, effective immediately." The gavel fell, And suddenly, I was responsible for 2 children again at 67 years old. Tyler and Chloe rushed toward me with huge smiles, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. The transition happened faster than I'd expected. Within a week, Tyler and Chloe had moved into my house permanently. Tyler took the larger spare bedroom, which I'd painted blue and furnished with a desk for homework and shelves for his growing collection of science fiction novels. Chloe claimed the smaller room, which became a pink and yellow sanctuary filled with art supplies and stuffed animals. The first few weeks were chaotic. School routines, meal planning, laundry schedules, and the general noise level of a house with children took adjustment. But it was good chaos, purposeful chaos, completely different from the unpredictable drama that had defined our family for years. The biggest surprise was how much I enjoyed being needed again. Not for money or convenience, but for genuine parenting support. Helping Tyler with algebra, listening to Chloe practice piano, attending school conferences, and managing the daily logistics of 2 active children gave my life structure and meaning I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Christmas that year was magical. Tyler and Chloe had lived through years of holidays shadowed by their parents' financial stress and marital problems. This Christmas was different, peaceful, joyful, focused on family instead of money. On Christmas morning, as we opened presents around the tree I'd helped them decorate, Chloe made an announcement that stopped my heart. "Grandma Maggie, can we call you Mom now? I mean, if you want us to. The kids at school keep asking about our parents, and it's weird to explain about prison and stuff." I looked at these 2 children who'd been through so much upheaval and somehow landed in my living room and felt overwhelming gratitude for the series of events that had brought us together. "I would be honored to be your mom," I told them, and meant every word. Tyler grinned. "Good, because I already put you down as emergency contact at school as Mom instead of grandmother. I hope that was okay." It was more than okay. It was perfect. But even as we settled into our new normal, I couldn't shake the feeling that David and Jessica's story wasn't finished. Prison sentences have end dates, and people who blame others for their problems rarely accept responsibility during incarceration. I was right to be cautious. In February, I received a letter from Jessica, written from county jail while she awaited sentencing. The letter was full of the same manipulative language I'd learned to recognize, promising change while demanding forgiveness and hinting that she expected eventual reconciliation. More concerning was the letter from David, which arrived a week later. His tone was different, angrier. He blamed me for destroying his family and poisoning his children against him. He promised that he would make things right once he was released. I showed both letters to Sarah Blackwood, who immediately filed motions to ensure David and Jessica would have no contact rights with Tyler and Chloe upon their release. She also recommended I document any future communication and consider obtaining restraining orders if the threats escalated. Mrs. Sullivan, people who refuse to accept responsibility for their actions often become more dangerous over time, not less. Your son has convinced himself that you're the villain in this story. That makes you a potential target when he gets out. How long do we have? With good behavior, probably 2 to 3 years. But I recommend we prepare for the worst-case scenario now, while we have time to put proper legal protections in place. That night, I sat in the garden with a cup of tea, watching Tyler and Chloe chase fireflies across the lawn. They were laughing and carefree, finally living the childhood they deserved. I'd moved mountains to give them this stability, and I wasn't about to let their biological parents destroy it again. David wanted to make things right? Perfect. Because I had a few things to make right myself, and I'd learned a lot about strategic planning over the past year. The old Maggie had been reactive, responding to crises created by others. The new Maggie was going to be proactive, anticipating problems and solving them before they became threats to my family. David thought prison was the worst thing that had happened to him. He was about to learn that underestimating his mother was a far more serious mistake. The detective called on a Tuesday morning in March, just as I was making pancakes for Tyler and Chloe before school. Detective Rodriguez from the Financial Crimes Unit had news that would change everything I thought I knew about my son's criminal activities. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need to ask you some questions about the mortgage payments you made for your son. We're investigating a much larger criminal network, and David's case has provided some unexpected leads." After the children left for school, Detective Rodriguez arrived with a thick file and a serious expression. She sat at my kitchen table, accepting coffee while organizing documents that looked far more complex than simple theft charges. "Mrs. Sullivan, how much do you know about your son's construction work?" "Very little, apparently. I thought he was a project manager for a local company, but clearly I was wrong about most things concerning David. He did work for Morrison Construction, but not as a manager. He was the equipment operator with access to expensive machinery and tools. What we've discovered is that he wasn't just stealing equipment. He was part of an organized theft ring that's been operating for nearly 5 years. The detective spread photographs across my table. Construction sites, heavy machinery, warehouse facilities, and shipping manifests with altered dates and signatures. This operation was sophisticated. They would steal equipment from job sites, alter serial numbers, and sell the machinery through fake companies in other states. David's role was identifying targets and providing inside information about security measures and delivery schedules. I studied the photos, feeling sick as the scope of David's crimes became clear. "How much money are we talking about?" "Over $2 million in stolen equipment and fraudulent sales." "David wasn't a small-time thief, Mrs. Sullivan. He was a key player in a major criminal enterprise." "And the mortgage money I gave him?" Detective Rodriguez pulled out bank records. "Your monthly payments weren't supporting his family. They were funding operational expenses for the theft ring. Vehicle rentals, storage facilities, document forgery, and bribes to security guards at various construction sites." The revelation was staggering. For 2 years I'd been an unwitting accomplice to organized crime, providing operational funding while thinking I was helping struggling young parents. "Detective, am I in legal trouble for unknowingly financing criminal activity?" "No. You're clearly a victim of deception, not a willing participant. But we do need your cooperation in building the case against the larger network." She explained that David and Jessica's arrests in Las Vegas had broken open the investigation. Faced with serious federal charges, David had started talking, providing information about other participants in exchange for a reduced sentence. The problem is, David's trying to minimize his own role by claiming he was coerced by more senior members of the organization. He's portraying himself as a victim who got in over his head. I almost laughed at the audacity. That sounds exactly like David. Nothing is ever his fault. Here's where it gets interesting for you personally. David claims his mother was a willing participant who knew exactly what the money was funding. He says you encouraged his involvement because the profits were helping the whole family financially. The coffee cup slipped from my hands, shattering on the kitchen floor. He's trying to implicate me in his crimes. It appears so. He's telling investigators that you were the mastermind behind the money laundering operation, using mortgage payments to disguise criminal proceeds. I stared at the detective, my mind racing through the implications. David wasn't just refusing to accept responsibility for his actions. He was actively trying to destroy me, to save himself. "Detective Rodriguez, I have documented evidence of every financial transaction, every conversation, and every interaction with David and Jessica. I can prove that I believed I was helping with legitimate household expenses." "We know. We've already reviewed your banking records and spoken with your attorney. Your story is consistent and well documented. But David's accusations mean you'll likely be called to testify in the federal trial." After the detective left, I sat in my garden trying to process what I'd learned. My son wasn't just a criminal. He was willing to destroy his own mother to avoid taking responsibility for his choices. The David who'd grown up in this house, who'd learned right from wrong at this kitchen table, was apparently capable of breathtaking betrayal when cornered. That afternoon, I called Sarah Blackwood and scheduled an emergency meeting. Then I called my financial advisor and asked for a complete audit of my accounts for the past 5 years. If I was going to testify in a federal criminal trial, I wanted documentation for every penny. But the real shock came that evening when Tyler approached me after dinner, his expression serious beyond his 13 years. "Mom, Maggie, there's something I need to tell you about Dad's work." I set down my dish rag and gave him my full attention. "What is it, sweetheart?" "Last summer, before everything happened, I overheard Dad talking to some men in our garage. They were talking about stealing stuff and changing numbers on machines. I didn't understand it all, but I knew it was bad." My heart stopped. "Did you tell anyone at the time?" "I tried to tell Mom, but she said I was imagining things and told me never to repeat what I heard. She said it would get Dad in trouble with his boss. Of course, Jessica had silenced him. She'd known exactly what David was involved in and had chosen to protect the criminal activity rather than her own child. Tyler, you're going to need to tell the police what you heard. It's important evidence in Dad's case. He nodded solemnly. I know. I've been thinking about it for weeks. I want to tell the truth, even if it makes Dad look bad. He made his own choices. At 13 years old, Tyler already understood something his father had never learned. Actions have consequences, and taking responsibility is more important than avoiding blame. That night, I sat in Frank's old chair and realized that David's attempt to implicate me had actually given me something valuable. Absolute clarity about who he really was and what he was capable of. The old Maggie might have been heartbroken by her son's willingness to sacrifice her for his own benefit. The new Maggie was simply resolved to make sure his lies didn't succeed. Tomorrow, I would start preparing for the fight of my life, because if David thought he could destroy me to save himself, he was about to learn that some mothers become more dangerous when their children are threatened, even when the threat comes from their own sons. The federal trial began on a hot Monday morning in September, exactly 1 year after David and Jessica had fled to Phoenix. I sat in the witness waiting room, wearing my best charcoal suit and reviewing the testimony I'd practiced with federal prosecutors for weeks. Tyler sat beside me, looking nervous but determined. At 14 now, he'd grown 3 inches and gained confidence that came from living in a stable home. Today, he would testify against his own father, and I'd never been prouder of his courage. Mrs. Sullivan, you're up first, said Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen. Remember, just tell the truth clearly and let the evidence speak for itself. The courtroom was larger than I'd expected, filled with attorneys, defendants, investigators, and family members of various people involved in the conspiracy. David sat at the defendant's table, wearing an orange jumpsuit and looking older than his 43 years. When our eyes met, his expression was cold, calculated, completely devoid of the warmth I remembered from his childhood. I took the oath and settled into the witness chair, looking directly at the jury as I'd been coached to do. 12 ordinary people who would decide whether David's lies about my involvement had any credibility. Prosecutor Chen began with basic questions about my relationship with David, the mortgage payments, and my understanding of his employment situation. I answered clearly and honestly, providing dates, amounts, and specific details about every transaction. Mrs. Sullivan, did you ever knowingly provide money to fund criminal activity? Absolutely not. I believed I was helping my son and daughter-in-law with legitimate household expenses during a difficult period. Did your son ever tell you he was involved in equipment theft or fraudulent sales? Never. He told me his construction business was slow and they were struggling to make mortgage payments. Then came David's attorney, a sharp woman in her 50s who'd obviously been coached on how to make me appear complicit. Mrs. Sullivan, isn't it true that you asked very few questions about how your money was being used? I trusted my son to be honest with me. That was apparently a mistake. Didn't you find it suspicious that David needed exactly the same amount every month, regardless of his claimed work situation? The mortgage payment was a fixed amount. That seemed perfectly reasonable. But you never verified that the money was actually going toward mortgage payments. Did you? This was the moment I'd been preparing for. Actually, I did verify it. The defense attorney looked surprised. Excuse me? I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila folder. In August, 2 months before I stopped making payments, I became concerned about David and Jessica's financial management. So I hired a private investigator to verify how my money was being used. A ripple of surprise went through the courtroom. This was new information, not included in any previous testimony. The investigator discovered that my money was not being used for mortgage payments. David and Jessica were using their own income for the mortgage and diverting my money to fund what appeared to be business expenses. Unexplained storage unit rentals, cash payments to unknown individuals, and large deposits into accounts I'd never heard of. David's attorney looked genuinely shocked. Why didn't you confront your son with this information? I planned to, but before I could arrange a meeting, my granddaughter publicly called me an old burden at a family dinner, clearly repeating something she'd heard at home. That's when I realized my money had bought me nothing but contempt from people I thought I was helping. So you cut off payments out of hurt feelings. I cut off payments because the private investigator's report made it clear that David was lying about how my money was being used. The disrespect from his family simply confirmed that continuing financial support would be throwing good money after bad. The prosecutor's redirect was brief and devastating. Mrs. Sullivan, when did you provide this investigative report to law enforcement? I gave it to Detective Rodriguez during her initial interview. It's been part of the evidence file for months. Checkmate. David's entire defense strategy had been based on claiming I was a knowing participant in money laundering, but I had documented proof that I'd investigated suspicious activity and discovered the deception myself. Tyler's testimony that afternoon was even more damaging to David's case. Speaking in a clear, steady voice, he described overhearing conversations about stolen equipment, altered serial numbers, and coordination with other criminal operators. Did your father ever ask you to keep these conversations secret? Prosecutor Chen asked. No, he didn't know I'd heard anything. But when I tried to tell my mother what I'd heard, she told me to forget about it and never repeat it to anyone. Did that seem strange to you? Yeah. If it was normal business stuff, why would she want to keep it secret? I knew something was wrong. David's attorney tried to discredit Tyler's testimony by claiming a child couldn't understand complex business conversations. But Tyler's responses were too detailed and specific to dismiss. During a break, I watched David conferring frantically with his attorney. His confidence was cracking as his strategy collapsed around him. But the real bombshell came during the afternoon session, when Prosecutor Chen called an unexpected witness, Detective Jennifer Walsh from the Las Vegas Police Department. Detective Walsh, were you involved in the arrest of David and Jessica Sullivan? Yes. We stopped their vehicle during a routine traffic check and discovered it was loaded with stolen construction equipment. Did the defendants make any statements during their arrest? Mr. Sullivan immediately claimed the equipment belonged to his mother, who was financing his business operations. He said she knew about the theft and was planning to fence the equipment in Nevada. I felt the blood drain from my face. David had tried to frame me for his crimes from the moment he was arrested. Did you find any evidence supporting Mr. Sullivan's claims about his mother's involvement? None whatsoever. Mrs. Sullivan was in her hometown at the time of the arrest, with multiple witnesses confirming her whereabouts. She had no connection to the stolen equipment beyond unknowingly providing money that funded the operation. David's face had gone completely white. He'd just been exposed as someone willing to destroy his own mother to escape responsibility for his crimes. That night, as I sat in my hotel room preparing for the next day's proceedings, I realized something profound had happened in that courtroom. I'd finally seen David with complete clarity, without the filter of maternal love and hope for redemption. He wasn't a man who'd made poor choices under pressure. He wasn't a victim of circumstances or bad influences. He was someone fundamentally willing to sacrifice anyone, including his own mother, to avoid consequences for his actions. The old Maggie would have been heartbroken by this revelation. The new Maggie felt only grim satisfaction that the truth had finally been revealed. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments and jury deliberation. But regardless of the verdict, I'd already won the most important victory. I'd protected Tyler and Chloe from parents who would have destroyed them, and I'd prevented David from destroying me. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their destructive behavior and let them face the natural consequences of their choices. David was about to learn exactly what those consequences looked like. The jury returned their verdict after less than 4 hours of deliberation. David Sullivan, guilty on all counts: federal conspiracy, interstate transportation of stolen goods, money laundering, and perjury for lying about my involvement. 15 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for 8 years. Jessica received 12 years for her role in the conspiracy. The other members of the theft ring received sentences ranging from 8 to 20 years. The judge specifically noted David's attempts to implicate his innocent mother as evidence of his lack of remorse and unwillingness to accept responsibility. I felt no satisfaction watching my son led away in shackles, only profound sadness for the man he'd chosen to become. But the real surprise came 3 weeks later when I received a call from attorney Marcus Webb, representing David's victims in a civil restitution case. Mrs. Sullivan, I have some news that might interest you. During the asset forfeiture process, we discovered something significant about your son's financial activities. Marcus arrived at my house that afternoon with a briefcase full of documents and a story that would change everything I thought I knew about David's criminal career. Mrs. Sullivan, your son wasn't just stealing equipment and fencing it through fake companies. He was also running elaborate insurance fraud schemes, identity theft operations, and investment scams targeting elderly victims. He spread documents across my dining room table: bank statements, insurance claims, fake investment prospectuses, and lists of victims that made my stomach turn. Over the past 5 years, David defrauded victims of more than $4 million. Elderly people who trusted him with their retirement savings, small business owners who hired him for construction projects that never got completed, and insurance companies he bilked with staged accidents and false claims. How does this affect me? Marcus pulled out a specific set of documents. Under federal asset forfeiture laws, all proceeds from criminal activity must be returned to victims. But there's an interesting complication in David's case. He showed me a bank routing document that made my blood run cold. Your son opened multiple business accounts using your social security number and personal information. He forged your signature on loan applications, business registrations, and insurance policies. I stared at the papers, seeing my name on documents I'd never signed, associated with companies I'd never heard of. Are you saying David stole my identity? Extensively. He used your excellent credit rating and clean financial history to establish credibility for his fraudulent operations. Several victims thought they were doing business with a reputable elderly woman, not a criminal in his 40s. The implications were staggering. David hadn't just taken my money and tried to frame me for his crimes. He'd actively impersonated me to commit additional felonies. Marcus, am I liable for debts or legal problems created by this identity theft? No. You're clearly a victim, not a perpetrator. But here's where it gets interesting from your perspective. He pulled out another document. Under federal law, victims of identity theft can seek damages from the perpetrator's assets, even if those assets would otherwise go to other victims. What assets? David and Jessica lost everything. That's what everyone assumed. But financial investigators discovered that David had been hiding money in offshore accounts and cryptocurrency investments that Jessica didn't even know about. Marcus handed me a financial statement that made my jaw drop. David accumulated nearly $1.8 million in hidden assets over 5 years of criminal activity, money he was planning to access after his eventual release from prison. And, as a victim of his identity theft crimes, you have legal standing to claim those assets as compensation for the damage to your credit, reputation, and emotional distress. Given the extent of his fraud using your identity, you could potentially claim the entire amount. I sat back in my chair, processing this information. David had not only stolen from strangers and tried to frame me for his crimes, he'd systematically used my identity to commit additional felonies while hiding nearly $2 million for his own future benefit. Marcus, what would happen to that money if I don't claim it? It would be distributed among his other victims, which is certainly justice, but it wouldn't address the specific harm done to you through identity theft. I thought about Tyler and Chloe, now 15 and 11 respectively, who would need college funding in a few years. I thought about the elderly victims David had defrauded, people like me who'd trusted someone they shouldn't have. I thought about the life David had stolen from his own children by choosing crime over responsibility. I want to claim half the assets for my grandchildren's futures. The other half should go to David's other victims, particularly the elderly ones who lost retirement money. Marcus smiled approvingly. That seems like a fair and generous solution. The legal process took 6 months to complete, but eventually, I received a check for $900,000 in restitution for identity theft damages. The remaining money was distributed among other victims, helping restore at least some of what David had stolen from them. On the anniversary of David and Jessica's sentencing, I sat in my garden with Tyler and Chloe, watching them work on homework under the old oak tree Frank had planted 30 years ago. Tyler was studying for his SATs, already planning for college with the confidence of a young man who knew his future was secure. Chloe was practicing piano, the same songs I'd learned as a child. They were good kids who'd survived terrible parents and emerged stronger rather than broken. They understood the value of honesty, responsibility, and hard work because they'd seen what happens when people choose differently. "Mom, Maggie," Chloe said, looking up from her music. Do you think Dad will try to contact us when he gets out of prison? I considered the question carefully. David would be eligible for parole when Tyler was 26 and Chloe was 23, both adults capable of making their own decisions about relationships with their father. He might try, I said honestly, but by then, you'll be adults who can decide for yourselves what kind of people you want in your lives. Tyler closed his textbook and looked at me seriously. I hope he's learned something from all this. But if he hasn't, I don't want him around our families when we have kids someday. At 16, Tyler already understood something David had never learned. Family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about people who support, respect, and care for each other through good times and bad. As the sun set over my garden, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought us to this peaceful moment. 3 years ago, I'd been a lonely widow being financially exploited by people who saw me as nothing more than a convenient ATM. Tonight, I was surrounded by children who genuinely loved me and a future bright with possibilities. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when it means losing people you thought you couldn't live without. Sometimes setting boundaries saves not just yourself, but innocent people who deserved better from the adults who were supposed to protect them. David had taught me an important lesson without meaning to. Respect isn't something you owe people because of their relationship to you. It's something people earn through their actions and choices. The roses in Frank's memorial garden bloomed magnificently that year. Their perfume carried on evening breezes that whispered promises of new beginnings and second chances. And for the first time since his death, I felt truly grateful for the life I was living instead of mourning the life I'd lost. The old Maggie had been a victim. The new Maggie was a survivor who'd learned the difference between being generous and being foolish, between being loving and being used. And that, I realized, was worth every difficult step of the journey that had brought me home to myself and the family I was truly meant to protect. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.